Hello everyone and welcome to this presentation on Chapter 14. The focus of this chapter is race and ethnicity. In common wisdom and in older sociology books, race is viewed as a biological fact, a simple reflection of skin color, or some other biological trait. Current thinking within sociology is that while people in a society may describe race in terms of biological traits, the reality of race lies in the processes of perception, how we see things, and how we define things. These processes by which members of any society attach meaning to any evident or imagined physical variation in people leads us to understand race and ethnicity involve the process of social construction. Consider that the definitions of race and ethnicity change over time. New racial and ethnic identities are evolving and emerging as a result of immigration, assimilation, and intermarriage. The U.S. Supreme Court invalidated state laws prohibiting interracial marriages in 1967, ruling that they were unconstitutional. Prior to that, people were jailed for marrying outside of their race. To illustrate a little better how both race and ethnicity are socially constructed, consider that in the United States, back in 1910, many people in large cities on the East Coast considered Italian or Jewish immigrants to be non-white. A century later, few would make this claim, and most people attach far less significance to ethnic traits. At the heart of social construction is the unequal standing of various categories of the U.S. population, which reflect the significance that members of a society attach to racial and ethnic traits. Sociologists argue that race is a social construction. They note that race has been constructed in such a way that it places some races above others. For example, blacks were deemed biologically and therefore socially inferior to whites during times of slavery and segregation. Well into the 1950s and 1960s, the civil rights movement was still fighting for equality between races. Race is a socially constructed category composed of people who share biologically transmitted traits that members of a society consider important. There are no biologically pure races. Race is a significant concept mainly because most people consider it to be such. Biologically speaking, race has less and less meaning and is of declining, although still great, importance in the United States. Sociologists also consider racial types at best misleading. Over many generations and throughout the Americas, the genetic traits from around the world have become mixed. More and more people define themselves as multiracial. Ethnicity is a shared cultural heritage. Ethnicity involves even more variability and mixture than race because most people identify with more than one ethnic background. While sociologists study racial categorization as a social construct aimed at creating advantages and disadvantages, sociologists refer to ethnicity as the shared cultural heritage of certain groups. More often than not, though, people define themselves as members of an ethnic group based on shared language or cultural characteristics, and the U.S. is multi-ethnic, but favors the English language and Protestant religion. Like race, ethnicity is most important within a social context. Race is constructed according to biological traits. Ethnicity, though, is constructed according to cultural traits. A minority is a category of people distinguished by physical or cultural traits, who are socially disadvantaged. Minorities have two distinguishing characteristics. They share a distinctive identity, and they occupy subordinate status. The share of minorities is increasing. The U.S. Census Bureau says that by the year 2043, minorities will form the majority of the U.S. population. The U.S. will have a minority majority. What changes do you think this will bring to U.S. society? Now, given the definitions of race and ethnicity, even though the word minority suggests that there are fewer in numbers, as a social category, it has less to do with numbers than with identity and subordination. For example, women outnumber men, but are considered a minority because they face discrimination based on sex. Not all members of minorities are underprivileged, but we look at the trends and not the exceptions in sociology. People who fall in a minority category often face prejudice, where all the people in the category are described in the same terms. In this way, a person may be prejudiced by referring to people of Latino origin as illegal. Prejudice can be in negative or positive terms, but generally when people talk about prejudice, it is negative. Attitudes about race and ethnicity shape how we interact with others and how we come to think about ourselves. Prejudice is a rigid and irrational generalization about an entire category of people. Prejudices are prejudgments. Prejudices are actually mental laziness. Some people take mental shortcuts and make snap judgments rather than taking the mental effort in order to get to know individuals better. Stereotypes are exaggerated descriptions applied to every person in some category. Now, one measure of prejudice is social distance. That is how closely people are willing to interact with members of some category. Almost 80 years ago, Emery Bogardus developed the 7-point social distance scale and determined that people felt much more social distance from some categories than others. Here's a snapshot of the social distance scale. I'm focusing on part A at the top, which is the scale that participants complete. So I imagine parts B, C, and D are rather difficult to make out. Now, participants can mark any of the numbers across this scale, and each number has an anchor to explain exactly what it means. Now, the least social distance is on the left. The most social distance is on the right. The social distance scale was used in a recent study in 2005 among college students, and it reported three major findings. First of all, a trend toward greater social acceptance has continued. Secondly, people see less difference through various minorities. What that means is they looked at the averages for each category, and they found that the range of these averages, or the spread, has decreased. And thirdly, the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks may have contributed to the low social acceptance of Arabs and Muslims in that particular study. A very powerful and harmful form of prejudice is racism, which is the belief that one racial category is innately superior or inferior to another. Back in 1865, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution outlawed slavery. But after Reconstruction, Jim Crow laws perpetuated the subordinate status of African Americans. In the first part of the 20th century, a mass migration of African Americans to the cities of the North occurred, followed by the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s. Even today, African Americans continue to be economically disadvantaged as a group, a problem exacerbated by the loss of factory jobs that has accompanied America's move to a service economy. The educational gap between whites and African Americans has narrowed substantially in recent years, and the political power of African Americans has increased in recent decades. This chapter also talks about several theories of prejudice. First, the scapegoat theory, which holds that prejudice results from frustrations among people who are themselves disadvantaged. A scapegoat is a person or category of people, typically with little power, whom people unfairly blame for their own troubles. Authoritarian personality theory views prejudice as a personality trait in certain individuals. The cultural theory of prejudice argues that prejudice is embedded in culture. And finally, the conflict theory of prejudice proposes that powerful people use prejudice to justify oppressing others. People of different racial and ethnic backgrounds tend to show four patterns of interaction in society. Pluralism refers to a state in which people of all racial and ethnic backgrounds share resources equally. In the U.S., people of all races and ethnicities now have equal standing under the law, but they do not yet share resources equally. Assimilation refers to the process by which minorities gradually adopt patterns of the dominant culture. This includes changing style of dress, for example. While the U.S. is multi-ethnic, there is certainly an expectation that different ethnicities and races assimilate into the dominant culture. Some cultures have assimilated more than others. Segregation refers to the physical and social separation of categories of people. While school segregation was upheld by the law until the passage of Brown versus the Board of Education, when schools in the South were forced to be open to both white and black children, informal segregation still occurs within the education system in the United States at roughly the same rate as when the civil rights legislation was passed in the mid-1960s. Finally, genocide is the systematic killing of one group of people by another. American Indians experienced genocide, as did the Jews in Nazi Germany and the Tutsis in Rwanda. So racial and ethnic subordination occurs and is largely attributable to how social structure creates and defines such categories. Earlier in the presentation, it was explained that prejudice is a rigid and irrational generalization about an entire category of people. Stereotypes are exaggerated descriptions applied to every person in some category. If I can use a medical sounding phrase, stereotypes may be thought of as hardening of the categories. Prejudice and discrimination reinforce each other. Prejudice, though, is an attitude or a belief. Discrimination is the action. It's important to be aware of the distinction between the two. Prejudice and discrimination do reinforce each other, as demonstrated by this graph from the text. In stage one, prejudice and discrimination begin often as an expression of ethnocentrism, or an attempt to justify exploiting a category of people economically. Now, as a result of prejudice and discrimination, in stage two, a minority becomes socially disadvantaged, occupying a low position in the system of social stratification. This social disadvantage is then interpreted not as the result of earlier prejudice and discrimination, but as evidence that the minority is innately inferior, creating new prejudice and discrimination, by which this cycle repeats itself. Pay attention to what happens in stage three. The belief that a minority is inferior innately occurs. And this is through a mental process, something called psychologists call fundamental attribution error. This is where the individual is blamed rather than environmental circumstances. The text goes into more depth than I will here in assessing the social standing of racial and ethnic categories of U.S. society, but I do want to talk briefly about Native Americans who were the original inhabitants of the Americas. Before European contact, they lived in hundreds of distinct societies, and they were evicted from their land. In perhaps the most tragic eviction of American Indians from their land, thousands of Cherokees died on a forced march that was called the Trail of Tears. They were driven from their homes in the southeastern U.S. to reservations in Indian Territory, later called Oklahoma, in 1838 and 1839. Between 1871 and 1924, they were subjected to a policy of forced assimilation. Now they're being encouraged to migrate from reservations to the cities in search of economic opportunity, but they remain far behind whites in educational and economic standing. Some other categories that are in the text White Anglo-Saxon Protestants, African Americans, Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Arab Americans. Many negative stereotypes surround Arab Americans. The increasing prominence of Islamic fundamentalism in the Middle East and acts of terrorism by Arabs have fueled a sense among some share of this country's population that Arabs are intolerant of U.S. political and social systems. As a result, many Arab Americans have suffered needlessly and regularly from discrimination and sometimes outright hostility. Keep in mind that Arab is a rather loose term that covers individuals tracing their ancestry to northern Africa and/or western or southwestern Asia, and that includes a variety of ethnic and cultural groups and many languages. In looking ahead, let's just make a couple of points in conclusion. Immigration has generated striking cultural diversity, and many arrivals have much the same prejudice and discrimination as experienced by those before them. One of the most controversial issues today is the control of the southern border of the United States. In recent years, major changes have taken place in the size of the Border Patrol and in the technology they use to track and control people attempting to cross the border from Mexico illegally. I've included a video in this unit called Securing the Border. Clearly, the leadership of the Border Patrol believes that huge strides have been made in controlling illegal immigration. But larger questions remain, such as the reasons for the high level of movement north from Mexico in the first place, and how much control of this immigration is actually desirable. Finally, the racial and ethnic profile of the United States is definitely changing. I mentioned earlier a recent projection by the U.S. Census Bureau. By 2043, if assumptions about the future hold, the majority of the U.S. population will be what we now describe as various racial and ethnic minorities. Even now, a majority of births in the United States are registered as some minority category. How will this overall transformation reshape the United States? This is a tough question to answer because demographic projections are subject to error, and the future trends that unfold can't be fully understood today. But one thing I feel confident in saying is that the changes are not likely to be small.